November, go.
So what I wanted to talk about was the notion that you've invested in creating a smarter city. You have your smarter transportation system, you have your smarter water system, you have all of these smarter systems installed, and then you have a flood or an earthquake. And all of a sudden you don't have a smarter city anymore at all, you have a pile of rubble. How do you deal with that? How do you extend the smarter paradigm to covering such an eventuality? And certainly the prevalence of natural disasters is growing. The number of people affected by disasters seems to be growing. There's a conspicuous spike upwards in the trend over the last 20 years. The damage levels are growing. Again, a conspicuous spike upwards over the last 20 years, and all of these trends are from a database called EMDAT, E-M-D-A-T. If you want to check them out for yourselves, you can easily find it on the web. Munich Re, big reinsurer, as you can imagine, the insurance industry is taking a very considerable interest in these kinds of trends and some of the issues that they are anticipating having, and they're actively exploring the causes for some of these trends. Munich Re put together a summary of the natural disasters in 2011, which I think will probably go down as the worst year yet in terms of the natural disasters that actually happened around the world. They logged over 800 incidents ranging through to full-blown disasters, whether we're talking about floods or famines or earthquakes or whatever it might be. But part of the issue that we have, we can sort of talk about the cause, and to some extent, especially after some of the comments around Hurricane Sandy in the United States last week, we can all speculate about the extent to which global warming is driving some of these things. It clearly isn't driving earthquakes directly. It may well be driving some of the other phenomenon that we're seeing. But one thing that is indisputable is that urbanization is concentrating the risk. So today you have the top 100 urban areas in the world account for 25% of the world's GDP. That's a good news, bad news story. And the bad news is you've got an incredible concentration of economic activity that is vulnerable to 100 single points of failure, if you will. The good news is only 100 points of leverage required, and you can influence 25% of the world's GDP. So it depends entirely on how you look at it. But the concentration of risk is undeniable. As many of you will know, for the first time, we have more than half the world's population living in cities. By 2050, that's going to be 70%. So urbanization, if you will, when it comes to resilience, when it comes to disasters, urbanization is, if you will, a risk multiplier. And that is something that we absolutely have to get our heads around, and that we absolutely have to deal with. But it's not just cities. I mean, companies like IBM or any other private sector company, we have a global supply chain. When the Thai flooding happened in 2011, we read in the newspapers about how Honda and Toyota had lost quite a lot of their production. Well, actually, we lost a large part of our hard disk drive supply. We were able to resource those hard disk drives, but at considerable expense to us. Intel, as per the cutting there, the flooding cost them $1 billion. The role that computing could have played, ICT could have played in that, is actually pretty substantial, both in terms of the prediction and the risk modelling that might have allowed people to better understand the risk of locating factories there in the first place. And certainly around good old-fashioned asset management, and this is not advanced information technology. Asset management has been around for 20 years. It would have allowed you to understand that, for example, some of the levees in the area of Thailand that was flooded had literally been stolen for building materials. Notional levies don't work very well. And the reasons that situation was allowed to exist was that there was no single overview of the status of the flood defence assets, or for that matter, where the storm drains were unblocked and that kind of thing. I'm not saying that there wouldn't have been flooding if those problems had been addressed. There probably would, but it probably would not have been as bad as was in fact the case. Dealing with that is an information technology issue, understanding the status of those assets, understanding that they were ready or they were not ready to do the work that they were required to do. That is one of the areas where information technology can actually play a role in resilience and disaster management. But it would be quite wrong, I think, to think about resilience as something you do in the immediate sort of aftermath, the immediate response to some event, or even immediately before an event. Resilience is a process. And it begins actually 10 years or maybe more than 10 years before the event in question. And if you don't know when the event in question is going to be, you might as well start now. The issues around understanding the impact that climate change is going to have on your area, understanding how demographic change is going to put more people in harm's way or conceivably take them out of harm's way. Those are multi-decadal issues. Being able to think about land use decisions, being able to think about areas where you need to harden or duplicate infrastructure. I was just hearing in a conversation this morning how in the very minor earthquake in the Virginia area last year in the United States, it was a very small earthquake indeed, the entire cell phone network was out for 3.5 hours. Because after this minor earthquake, I live in California, so kind of I get blasé about earthquakes, but on the east coast of the United States it's a different matter. Everybody was phoning home to say, I'm all right, I'm all right. Well, of course you were all right, but in the meantime you were taking down the cell phone network and people that really did need to respond couldn't use it. So thinking about the resilience and the redundancy that is built into critical systems, that's a decade-long decision, a decade-long investment process. Thinking about building codes. The western half of the United States, to take an area I know well, and I dare say in Japan as well, building codes have been an issue for the last 20, 25 years around earthquake resilience, but likewise around floods. The incidence of property damage dramatically increases if you have buildings with basements, because the basements fill with water. There's plenty of building code issues around that as well, in terms of the types of buildings that are physically allowed to be put up in a particular area. Then you get to the kind of the year-long scale. Talk about public awareness. That's a multi-year process. Emergency planning and simulation. The kind of thing that IBM is now starting to do in earnest around corporate risk assessment, understanding where our suppliers' factories are as well as just our own factories, so that we can account for the integrity of our entire supply chain when we need to. The insurance industry, planning its risk portfolio from year to year to year. Those are year-scale decisions, if you will. Then you start to get close to the event, and I put the event as something that spans a period of time, because if you think about a famine or a drought, it's an event that unfolds over a period of time. It's not an instant thing like a flood or an earthquake. But you're thinking about then, okay, so how do I monitor this pandemic? How do I monitor this drought? How do I monitor this famine? How do I understand how bad it's likely to get? Seasonal weather forecasting. The flooding that existed in that took place in northern Australia, I think it was in 2010. The Australian government had a warning 4 months beforehand to expect abnormal weather events in northeastern Australia. Unfortunately, at that time, it wasn't possible to make them more specific, and you can't kind of evacuate the whole of Queensland for 4 months just on an ad hoc warning. But being able to actually firm those models up and actually come up with something more specific and more actionable. And then you get down to the stuff that people truly understand about resilience and an event response in the days and the hours right before it, evacuating people, forecasting flooding extents and that kind of thing, tracking the event, issuing alerts and so forth. And then in the hours and the days right after the event, what just broke, who needs shelter, who needs first aid, who needs power, who needs to be dug out of this building, where have we got property damage, where are people at risk. And then moving after that to starting to search for the bodies for the people that we couldn't actually get out in time. And that then unfolds into the weeks and the months around debris removal, restarting the infrastructure, what I call the economic reboot, if you will, in that particular area. And then as the weeks and the months unfold, loss adjustment, insurance payouts, and then rebuilding, long-run recovery, and so on. So that's what I say. That's what I mean when I say that resilience is a process. It runs over, if you will, around any given event, 10 years before the event, and maybe up to 5 years, 10 years even after the event as well. And the role that information technology plays, and this is my final slide, the role that information technology plays is absolutely pervasive at every single level. So if you take an example of flooding, and this list would be different for earthquakes, but if you take flooding as an example, the stuff around climate and rainfall, modelling that, predicting that, understanding the extents, constructing scenarios, the stuff around the geology and the topography. So how much of the hillside around us has been deforested? What's its capacity to soak up rainfall rather than just transmitting that rainfall down into the valley where it's going to become a flash flood? How saturated is the ground at any point in time? All of this is the domain of computer modelling. All of this is the domain of sensing, remote observation, and so on. River channel conveyance and delineation. So if this river really was called upon to handle a flood, how much can it handle before it breaks its banks? Land use. What have we got in harm's way? Does it matter? If we lose this electricity substation, how much else do we lose? What assets are linked to that substation? And what assets are linked to those assets? And therefore, how do we deal with that? Is this levee high enough? Is it hard enough? Is it resilient enough in itself? Again, these are computing, data, information system kinds of issues. What infrastructure alternatives do we need? How do we model the behaviour of the cell phone system? How do we model the behaviour of the energy grid? How do we model the behaviour of a water system when they've had big lumps knocked out of them? How can we make them more resilient? How do we model that? Again, these are computing, information technology kind of issues. Drainage. How well does the urban drainage system actually work? How much can it carry? Therefore, how big a rainfall event could it actually deal with before it starts to cause localised and then eventually more widespread flooding? Building codes. So what 3 or 4 changes should we make to building codes to improve the resilience in this particular city to this particular class of event? Again, these are all computing problems. These are all information technology kind of problems, and so on, through to the stuff that you probably recognise around emergency planning, provisioning, emergency procedures and execution, and so on, the control rooms, the cameras, and all of the kind of stuff that you might expect. They're all about data. They're all about models. They're all about scenario exploration and forecasting. They're all about visualization and decision support. They're all about integrating data, capturing feedback maybe from sort of cell phones and citizen sensing as well. So augmenting the information resources that you have available to you as a city government with what the population may be capturing capturing for themselves. All about effective, resilient communication systems, all about education, and so on. So in the time available to me, I've just very quickly sketched out the role of information technology around resilience. It's a multi-layer, multi-timescale kind of problem. Let me stop there and hand over to the next speaker. Thank you very much.